Once I got to grad school, and toward the end of grad school, I started to develop doubts about whether Christianity was true. It wasn't anything necessarily that I had learned. It was just starting to think, well, what if I'd been born in Afghanistan? Would I be a Muslim? What if I'd been born in China? Would I be an atheist? If I'd been born in India, would I be a Hindu? Could it be that I'm deceiving myself, that I'm deluding myself to think that I'm having a good relationship with the Lord, when I've just really been conditioned to believe this way? And so that got me into looking at the evidence for Christianity.
I am so glad you're joining me for the Glory Hour, where it's all about spirit meets culture. And as always, we want you to connect with us. So be sure to follow us. Go to the Glory Hour podcast on Cornerstone Television Network's YouTube channel. We always love to hear from you. So be sure to drop a comment, share your thoughts with us, what you're thinking, what you're dealing with, or you can also email us your thoughts, your comments at thegloryhour@ctvn.org. And I am really looking forward to our time together today, because what we're talking about is very, very important. It has to do with the condition and state of your soul and my soul. And we see this happening in our generation, whether you're millennial, Gen Z, Gen Xers, baby boomers, all of us. We are coming to this point. We have to know about our spirituality, where we stand with God, and about our eternal home and resting place. And because a lot of us are searching for deeper purpose and understanding and truth like never before. I think about what's going on in our culture. We see what's happening in the arts and entertainment industry. And it seems a lot, if you're on, social media, if you're on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, you see there's a lot of celebrities that are sharing their faith, and they're talking about where they stand spiritually. We see so much darkness that is happening in the music industry. I mean, we saw what was happening with Lonas and that whole thing. He has his, J. Christ video, whatever. We don't want to go into that. But we do see that there is this wrestle between dark and light. There's a lot of people who are looking and searching for hope and looking for Jesus. And so one thing I spotted recently on TikTok, I wanted to share this with you, is with actor, comedian, and cultural thought leader Russell Brand, and his take on where he stands with Jesus and Christianity. Take a look.
The reason I wear a cross is because Christianity, and in particular the figure of Christ, are, it seems to me, inevitably becoming more important as I become more familiar with suffering, purpose, self, and not self. Reading the Bible a lot more, and as I've told you before, I'm reading Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life. When I grew up, Christianity seemed like it was either really irrelevant and old-fashioned and sort of dusty and sort of incense and sort of Anno Domini, or they tried to modernise it, and it seems just like, right, okay, we're going to talk about Jesus. And both of those routes seem like, I don't know if there's anything for me. And I suppose it takes a certain amount of adulthood, and it might be different for all of us. For me, it seems that it's taken quite a lot to recognise that I need a personal relationship with God. It occurred to me that if instead of always talking to myself inwardly, I could replace one of those voices with an indwelling God. It says in Galatians, it is our job to die, so that as Christ died on the cross, he might be reborn in us.
I really like what Russell Brand was just sharing there about how important it is for us to be reborn. We have to die with Christ. We have to die with ourselves and have this spiritual rebirth and renewal. And I think it's really interesting. Maybe it's a book many of you have read. I've read it, Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life. And so I really appreciated his exploration of spirituality and into Jesus and with the faith. And I think that's where a lot of people are looking into now. We see the way that the world is. We see the darkness that is unfolding. And I think even since the pandemic, when we've all had those inward times that, spent a lot of times with ourselves and having self-reflection, I think it's a really, really healthy thing. Well, we want to move along because, there are a lot of people that are searching for deeper truth and understanding. And, a lot don't understand where they fit in when it comes to faith. And so I found this for you. Take a look at this. The Pew Research Center recently did a study and found 20% of adults in the U.S. are religiously unaffiliated, meaning they describe themselves as atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular. And they're actually categorized and called as nuns. So here's a breakdown, as you see on the screen, of what nuns say that they are non-religious. Here's the reasons why. 67% say disbelief, doubt, skepticism. 60% they question a lot of religious teachings. 32% don't believe in God or a higher power. 47% don't like religious organizations. I think we've all heard that a lot of times. And 30% say that bad experiences with religious people. That last one actually breaks my heart because I think that really does stir a lot of people away. You know, if you have a bad experience with a Christian, maybe you're watching this because you saw they're like, what are they going to be talking about? And you've had a bad experience with a Christian. I just first want to say, I want to apologize and repent and ask for your forgiveness on behalf of all Christians, because I know that is such a big thing of the way that as we that claim that we love Jesus, we follow Jesus, but we misrepresent God and we misrepresent him out to the world. And people have a lot of church hurt and are so turned off by church. So if that's you, I just want to apologize to you today. You know, we're also want to look at another study. So Pew Research took a look at what religious nuns actually believe. So these are atheists, agnostics, maybe don't know where they stand or where they fall. So listen to this. 13% they believe in God described in the Bible. 56% believe in an other higher power. 29% believe in neither, so no God, no higher power, nothing. And 2% are unclear and they don't know. So, you know, I think it's interesting that most nuns believe in God or a higher power, but not in the biblical God. It's very, very interesting because I have heard that when you are, you know, say an agnostic or, you know, an atheist and you don't believe, right, you have to believe in something. And it's really interesting. So I really like looking at that study. If you're a thinker, a doubter, or want to know more about the existence of Jesus, today's guest is just for you. Dr. Mike Licona is a professor of New Testament studies for Houston Christian University and president of Risen Jesus, which provides authentic answers about Christ's resurrection and historically reliability to the Gospels. His quest for truth has led him on an amazing journey where he has publicly debated some of the world's leading critics of Christianity. Dr. Mike, I'm so glad that you're with us on the Glory Hour.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Sydney. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's great to be with you, Dr. Mike. And, you know, just before we dig into, you know, just your history of debating, you know, those who have doubted Christianity, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and became a Christian at the age of 10. And I didn't grow too much spiritually during my teens. When I did go off to college, I guess in my later teens, I went to Liberty University, a Christian university, and that's where I really started to grow spiritually. It was a real small university or college back then, I think 1,200 students. So, yeah, I was really just giving myself over to studying scripture and praying, developed a really robust prayer life. And I'd say once I got to grad school and toward the end of grad school, I started to develop doubts about whether Christianity was true. It wasn't anything necessarily that I had learned. It was just starting to think, well, what if I'd been born in Afghanistan? Would I be a Muslim? What if I'd been born in China? Would I be an atheist? If I'd been born in India, would I be a Hindu? Could it be that I'm deceiving myself, that I'm deluding myself to think that I'm having a good relationship with the Lord when I've just really been conditioned to believe this way? And so that got me into looking at the evidence for Christianity, and it just got addicting, and it really helped my doubts. And I found that a lot of other people had doubts as well. And so our ministry is to present and defend the message and teachings of Jesus for those who doubt, and those who doubt being Christians who are experiencing doubts and questions, as well as non-believers who are seeking.
You know, Dr. Mike, like, just want to go back to a point because I can relate being in college, being a young person. And I remember, you know, like the same way, like my mom would take me to church every Sunday and I love Jesus and pray to Jesus. But there's something about when you hit those like 1920s where you start really, when you're around other people, just start kind of questioning why you believe what you believe. And so I know for me, like in college, we had a class that it was called Intellectual Heritage. And there was Intellectual Heritage 1 and Intellectual Heritage 2. And I remember the first class where we had to read the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and we read parts of the Bible. And that was the first time, like, I opened up another religious book. I had a lot of questions that surfaced too. So I just really loved what you brought up of even, if you were born in Afghanistan, if you were born in China, would you believe what you believe? And so can you talk a little bit about like that during that time of just that quest and just searching what it was like for you, what certain things that you would stumble upon or like roadblocks that you would hit and be like, I don't know about Jesus. I don't know about why I believe what I believe.
Well, for one, I wanted to, like, I remember two Mormons coming to my door and was meeting with them, and they started to explain, the story about Mormonism and some of the things Mormons believe. And I stopped them and I said, look, I don't want to put the cart before the horse here. If Mormonism is true, then I want to know everything about what Mormons believe and what I should believe. But if Mormonism is false, then I really don't care what Mormons believe. So can we just talk about the evidence that Mormonism is true? And I don't think they had faced that before. And so we decided to like part ways for a week and come back next week. And they would do some research and I would do some research. And I called and spoke to some professors at Brigham Young University who were anthropologists, Book of Mormon archaeologists. And they went and they consulted some of their superiors in the field. And then we got back together and I was presenting all this data that challenged Mormonism that I'd gotten from Mormon scholars saying that there is no archaeological data that would specifically confirm the things in the Book of Mormon. Anyway, so that was like Mormonism. And then I'd look at Islam and not necessarily what they believe, but the origins of Islam and whether it was true and how you would, what's the test that Muslims give to know that Islam is true. And what do we do with those? And then I looked at Christianity and things like that. So that's what it was like. And finally, in the midst of my doubts, I did get involved in a PhD research program on the resurrection of Jesus. And the reason being is because Jesus put the resurrection as the test to know whether he was who he's claiming to be. And in fact, the Apostle Paul put the resurrection there too. He said, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. And so everything for Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's what I started to look at. And doing my doctoral work, I tried to approach this as a historian and be as objective and unbiased as I could. Nobody can be totally unbiased or objective, but I was really trying the best I could because, we don't have to worry about truth. We don't have to fear truth. What we have to fear is that our biases will get in the way and keep us from discovering truth, and it costs us eternity.
Wow. Wow. What you just said, I feel like that's just like want to put a pin in that, is that our biases will stop us from walking in truth, and that has eternal impact. And Dr. Mike, I'm just really curious because I know when we talked earlier and you mentioned, saying you had this doctoral, dissertation about the resurrection, the historical fact of Jesus. What did you find? What did you discover? I know somebody's probably very curious about that.
Wow, there's a lot of stuff. Where do you start? It's like being a mosquito in a nudist camp. Where do I begin? Well, I really didn't know how historians carry on their work. And so I had to do some work with the philosophy of history. And I learned in that process that there's a lot of stuff in which historians just don't agree. They don't even agree on how to define history. They don't agree on exactly what it is that historians are doing. And then you have postmodern historians versus realist historians. And so I was learning that, plus I was learning how to do historical investigation, how to manage my own biases during the course of that investigation, things that I could put actions that I could take that would put roadblocks with my own biases so that I could be as objective as possible. And then it was like, okay, well, can historians investigate miracle claims? Many historians don't think that they can. Well, what are they saying? Why do they think historians can't investigate miracle claims? Because if they can't, then you really can't do a historical investigation on the resurrection of Jesus. So I had to deal with that. I found their arguments to be pretty weak. Then it's like, all right, what are our best sources to investigate this? And then once you look at those, you can't just assume the Bible is divinely inspired in God's word when doing a historical investigation, because the divine inspiration of Scripture is a theological belief that cannot be proved by historical investigation. You can give rational arguments for it, but you can't prove that through historical investigation. And my investigation was purely as a historian. If I'm approaching the resurrection as a historian, what does that look like, and what kind of conclusions can I come? So I'm looking at, reasonably speaking, apart from faith, what are the best sources? And then what do those sources reveal that we can put our hands on and say, regardless of biases, we can know these things. And then what are the best explanations for these? I was surprised at how well the resurrection hypothesis does. And in fact, I thought it was going to do better than the others. I just didn't anticipate how much better than some of the other alternative explanations the resurrection hypothesis is when you compare them using historical method.
Wow. So can you dig into that? So was there one thing during your research where you're like, whoa, there's really something here. There's like something that shocked you just in your search and your research?
Well, I'd say perhaps the best historical evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to go about this, but if we're going to look at, let's say, the number one, the strongest point, the strongest source that can be made in what we learn is the Apostle Paul. And the reason being is his letters are probably written prior to the gospel, so they're early. We know from Paul in Galatians chapter 1 and Galatians chapter 2 that he had interactions with the leading apostles in Jerusalem, Peter, James, and John, whom Paul calls the pillars of the church. He said he ran his gospel message past them to confirm whether he was on message with them, and he said that they certified that he was on message with what they were proclaiming. And from the writings of other early church fathers who knew the disciples, or probably knew them, I'm referring to Clement of Rome, who probably knew Peter, and Polycarp, who probably knew John. They speak in very laudatory terms of Paul. In fact, Polycarp says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth, which is something entirely compatible with Paul's claim that Peter, James, and John had certified that he was on message with what they're teaching. At least with the gospel message. So then it's like, all right, well, I wonder if we have where he articulates his gospel message anywhere. And we do. 1 Corinthians 15, he says, verse 1, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. And then he goes on and gives it, the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances, verses 3 through 8. And he says, I delivered to you what I also received. So he's getting this information from the Jerusalem apostles. So when we are reading Paul on the gospel message, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. This is from a guy that even skeptical scholars will say he knew the Jerusalem apostles, and at least with the gospel message, he's proclaiming the same message they're proclaiming. And they're proclaiming the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus to individuals and to groups. So what do we get from this? Well, if it's the original disciples themselves who are proclaiming this, the followers of Jesus, well, then it wasn't a legend that developed over time, right? Because it started with the alleged eyewitnesses. Were they lying? Well, we have a number of ancient sources, in fact, even just from the first century alone, that mention that these disciples were willing to suffer and willing to die, and at least some of them were martyred for the Christian faith. Again, this is all from the first century, which suggests very strongly that they truly believed what they were proclaiming. They weren't just proclaiming Jesus rose, they truly believed it, which means they weren't lying. Because these appearances occurred to groups. They weren't hallucinations. And because they occurred to 100% of them, according to their own reports, well, another reason why they weren't hallucinations, and because Paul, a skeptic who was persecuting the church, converted because he had an experience he was convinced was an appearance of the risen Jesus, probably wasn't a hallucination, because Paul wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have wanted to see or expected to see. So just from this, the historian can rule out legend, lies, and hallucinations just from this one bit of data that comes from Paul.
Wow. Dr. Mike, when you're just saying something, it just hit me, just listening to the history, listening to all the records, and people are taking it out like, this is my experience. It's not a legend, it's not a lie, and it's not a hallucination, which when you put it that way, I was like, oh, I never thought about it like in that way. But isn't it so powerful? Like, I was even thinking as you were sharing, like, I'm so grateful God gave us hands and the ability to read and to write and to share these things. And I just think about, like, if this happened, with social media, they didn't have social media and different things, like how this was going viral all around the world and they couldn't stop the spread of the message and what Jesus was doing. It's really insightful, because I think a lot of times, when, we read the Bible and we're taking it in for ourselves, but even thinking about, like, no, this completely changed people's lives upside down. It completely changed the whole world and just the whole infrastructure, just everything at the time. And, Dr. Mike, I was just like curious, how did, as you were doing this research and you're exploring these things, learning about these things, how did it personally impact you and your faith, and then inspire you to create Risen Jesus, your ministry?
Well, as I'm going through the process, I wasn't inspired. In other words, I really wrestled with this stuff because of I recognized I had my own biases and a tendency to want to verify that Jesus rose from the dead, which I suppose that's okay, but you really have to put that in check, or else it will unfairly tilt your I found okay, so here's the thing. I found myself when I'm reading books and journal articles written by skeptics of the resurrection, at first I was just kind of glancing through them, not taking them seriously, because I kind of already knew what their conclusion was. And when I read Christians on the resurrection of Jesus, well, then I looked real carefully because I wanted to understand the arguments given. And then I thought, well, that's not being objective. If I'm going to be objective and approach this in the interest of discovering truth, I have to read the skeptics every bit as carefully and with an open mind as I do the Christians. And so I had to go back and reread some of these things. It was a really laborious task to do all this work. And I can remember one night laying in bed, the lights were out, and I thought my wife was asleep. And I'm just laying there thinking, and then I hear her voice pierce the darkness, and she said, "You're doubting again, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And she says, "Well, do you believe Jesus rose from the dead?" And I said, I don't know. I haven't got to the part where I'm really going to examine the various hypotheses carefully and objectively." She says, "What do you believe?" And I said, "Well, I do believe that there's a supreme being. I do believe that God exist, because the evidence for an intelligent designer of the universe and life itself, to me, is really compelling. But I really want to approach the resurrection as objectively as I can, and I'm just really wrestling. I don't know what I believe anymore at this point, and but I just want to do this with the greatest amount of integrity and follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter what the consequences are. You have to understand, I'm kind of leading apologetics. I'm one of the leading voices for Christian apologetics in the Southern Baptist Convention, working for the North American Mission Board at this time. So I recognize that if I come to the conclusion that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I got to resign my position and go find something else to do. So I'm fighting the bias for that and fighting it by thinking, okay, but if I conclude Jesus didn't rise from the dead, yeah, I'll lose my job, but maybe I can write a book arguing Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and Atheist will buy it, and I'll make a lot of money that way, and I can support myself. So anyway, so this is the kind of stuff, just really, really wrestling with this to come to be as objective and as open-minded as possible. And again, I'm not saying I reached that completely, but I can say that I was really making an honest attempt. It was toward the end when I really started applying historical method to the various hypotheses. Hallucination. The disciples just used resurrection as a metaphor to say Jesus was exalted into heaven, or that his memories and teachings still live among us, and things like that. And then compared them with the resurrection hypothesis, that I began just to see just how good the resurrection hypothesis is at explaining the virtually undisputed facts, and how poorly the other hypotheses do. And that gave me great confidence, once again, that the resurrection of Jesus actually occurred, that God exists, that he's revealed himself to mankind in Jesus Christ, and that what I had originally believed was intimate fellowship with God through prayer and Bible study, I had good reason to believe that it actually was real and intimate fellowship with him, because the historical data backed up the fact that Christianity is true.
Wow. You know, I like, Dr. Mike, just your transparency of just when you were sharing about that moment with your wife, and like, you know, you're having this moment of like, I don't know right now where I stand. But as you continue to press on and to seek him, it was just like really beautiful, just like this intimate relationship where it's like there is historical fact, we can prove the existence of Jesus and the resurrection. And I know when we started our conversation, you said you know, you're a man of prayer and you love to pray. And I'm just curious, like, what was it like for you after, you know, finding all this? You did your doctoral dissertation, just the spaces that you're in. How did your relationship personally with Jesus change when you're like, I've been on this whole quest trying to prove if you're real Jesus, but now there's this intimate one-on-one that you're having with him in a very different way that most of us, because most of us will never, you know, do the extensive research or go into that. But you had an incredible moment and opportunity with God to experience him in a very unique and I truly believe a divine way.
That is an excellent question, Sydney. And I'll be transparent again. During my doctoral research, my relationship with the Lord became quite cold, because I'm trying to do this as objectively as I can. And so I can remember praying, God, I believe that you exist. I do think that Christianity is true, but I really do have to look at this as objectively as I can. Please show me if Christianity is false. I want to follow the truth. Please show me if it's false. And if what I'm doing here is sinful or wrong, please forgive me. You know my heart on this. You know I want to come to truth. And this is the time in my life where I'm just really devoting myself to follow truth, no matter where it leads. So then once I came to the conclusion Jesus rose from the dead, and finished my doctoral work. By the way, while I was doing all of this, I engaged in multiple public debates with some of the leading skeptics out there. People like Bart Ehrman, who's the most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in the world. He's an atheist. I debated him. I debated Elaine Pagels at Princeton. I debated Shabir Ali, the leading Muslim debater in the world, many of these, because I wanted to see if the arguments I was presenting could withstand the most critical, the toughest critical scrutiny. So after I got through that whole process and concluded Jesus rose from the dead, I figured, okay, I'm going to be able to jump right back into this great relationship with the Lord. And Sydney, I just got to admit, it just didn't work out that way. Because the kind of it's like when you're asking these tough questions and then you finish, you can't just stop and like you're turning off flicking a light switch, and then you just go back to the way things were. I still continued with a dry spell, and it stayed that way for a little. And then I can remember reading a book on prayer by Tom Eliff, I think is his name. And that really sparked my my prayer life, my spiritual life back to health. Can I say it's that way all the time? No. A lot of times my prayer life is very dry, and it would stay that way for years, you could say. And then I'll say this, just one more thing here. I'm sorry if I'm going on too long.
You are fine. No.
This is probably important for a lot of your viewers. So a couple of years before he died, the great Anglican theologian, highly respected evangelical, J.I. Packer, who wrote the book Knowing God that sold millions and millions of copies. I had an opportunity to spend some time with him. And I remember Paul Copan, a Christian philosopher, and Paul was driving. Professor Packer was in the front seat. He was just getting ready to turn 90 years old at the time. I think he would die 2 years later. Wow. And I'm in the back seat, and I said, Professor Packer said, "Oh, Mike, call me Jim." So, Jim, okay, Jim, Jimmy, Jimbo. No, hey, Jim, look, and I told him about the dryness in prayer, and I said, what do you do when you have periods of dryness, long periods of just feeling really dry in your prayer life? And I figured, okay, I'm talking to the great author who wrote Knowing God. I'm in his presence right now. I'm asking him, what do you do in your prayer life when you go through periods of dryness? And here's what he said. I just keep praying. Come on, give me something really profound here. What do you mean you just keep praying? And he said, yep, I just keep praying. And he said, Mike, my prayer life is more often than not periods of dryness. He says, you just got to keep praying. And I thought, well, on the one hand, that's kind of encouraging because I recognize that my experience was a lot like others. But in the other hand, it was kind of like a little downer because it's like, okay, well, this is what it's like. We experience God differently than, say, I'm experiencing you, being able to communicate with Sydney by seeing you and hearing you. We can't do that with God. And so we've got to learn to communicate in a different manner with him.
Dr. Mike, when you were just talking about that moment, because I can imagine like you're waiting for like this deep moment, like this quote, right? And he's just like, just keep praying. You're like, I'm trying. Sometimes we get in those moments as dry spells. But when you were talking, just reminds me of just where like a scripture that Jesus was just even reminding me. But he's like, come to me, all who are thirsty, and he is the living water. And just how often in our human existence, which I think is really hard, is that there's moments where you feel so connected to Jesus. I feel like I'm on a Holy Spirit high. And I'm like, yes, Lord, I'm hearing from you. And then there's moments it's like crickets. I'm like, where are you? Where are you at, Jesus? And that keep on pressing is very, very hard. And I think that's why we want to know your thoughts, because this is how I feel. I feel like that's what makes our faith with Jesus different. It's this relationship and it's out of revelation, which is, I just feel like it makes it very, very different. It's like constant communication with God and hearing from him and learning to like go in his ways. But it is really hard. A lot of times we find ourselves in the wilderness or we're like, where are you, God? And that's something I think it is hard to deal with in our faith.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sydney. The times too that I think that a lot of us feel closest to God is when we are going through very, very difficult trials in our lives. And we're either grieving or we just feel we have a need that's not being fulfilled and we desperately want it to be fulfilled, or we have something that is really burdening our hearts, or we're experiencing a lot of chronic pain and we're just crying out to God, help me. When we're seeking God in that way, it seems that he draws nearer to us and allows us to experience or feel his presence. And so we have to be careful because, maybe we say, well, God, I want to feel your presence. Well, okay, but you're going to have, there's a price to pay for that. It's kind of like, boy, God, I wish the evidence was a little bit better. I wish I could see you face to face right now. That would increase my faith. Well, yes, it would. But then you look at Paul. He's caught up to the third heaven, and he sees things that are so amazing that he can't even express them in human words. And because of that, in order to keep him from becoming boastful, God gives him a thorn in the flesh that Paul prays, asks God to take it away. And God says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in your weakness. It's like, okay, well, I think sometimes to pray, God, would you, can I see you? Can I, would you allow an angel or something? I don't know, give me a vision or something. And then I think, what if God said to me, Mike, I can do that, but I'm going to have to give you a thorn that comes along with that. And then I think, all right, well, it'd be nice, but I don't need it. You really have given me sufficient evidence to know that Christianity is true, evidence for God's existence, evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. You've answered many, many of my prayers, even amazing prayers, and revealed yourself to me in very personal ways at times. I guess I'll be satisfied with that.
You're just talking, Dr. Mike. I was just thinking of the story in the Bible. It's like doubting Thomas. It's like, oh, I need to see the nail in your hands, And a lot of times we're like, oh, look at you, doubting Thomas. But how often do we doubt? Honestly, like I feel like what you're talking about is like, because there's moments I was like, yeah, I want to see an angel appear. I want the glory to fall down. All these things, but when it doesn't happen, it's like, does my belief just go away? Do I not trust that God is not there? Because He's God and He can do whatever He wants to do. And I think that is something that's hard with our faith, especially as Christians. And I'm sure, like, I can't even imagine even going back to when you're on these world stages debating with these top skeptics of Christianity and dealing with your own just your own walk with God, where it is hard, where, I've had relationships and conversations with people who don't believe in Jesus and, asking these things. And it just takes I'm trying to even find the words, God help me, where it just takes this whole different level of faith. And like, I feel like we go, we talk about go from in the church, a lot of times it's because we go from glory to glory. But a lot of those times that going to glory is the suffering, the persecution, the hardship. When you're talking about that thorn in the side, that's what comes with it. And I think that's a really hard thing to sometimes deal or bear. And, one thing I wanted to ask you too, Dr. Mike, is, you're on a college, you have a lot of your students, they're young. And we hear in our generation that there's a lot of Gen Z, millennials are turning away from the faith. So what is your experience when it comes to, working, teaching, leading this next generation? What are their thoughts? What are some of the things you're hearing about those that are younger in their faith?
You're right, Sydney. There are a lot of college students who have been brought up in the church. They are believers, and they, the term used for it now is they deconstruct their faith. They walk away from their Christian faith, and it's a sad thing. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, they're brought up in church to believe based on experience, based on, well, this is what the Bible claims about itself, and we have faith. And they're not really ever taught that there are reasons, intellectual reasons for thinking and believing that Christianity is true, that there's actually evidence for the existence of God, philosophical evidence, there's scientific evidence for an intelligent designer of the universe and of life itself. And there are many of the most elite, some of the most elite scientists in the world are Christians and are convinced by the scientific evidence that it points to a designer of the universe and life. And then you look at the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. They are just not aware that this kind of stuff exists because they're not taught it in truth. Christian apologetics, they're not even aware of such a discipline. So our churches need to be better at equipping and teaching our youth about these things so that when they go off to college or a secular university, where their faith is definitely going to be attacked, they are ready for it. Another thing is when they go off to the university, they need to get involved in a campus ministry where they are fellowshipping with like-minded Christians. A few years back, I've been to Israel twice, and I've been there on the Sabbath and the day approaching it. So like on Friday afternoon, I was in both times I was in a marketplace in Jerusalem, and Israel is very secular, but Jerusalem is not. Jerusalem is, you've got a lot of pious Orthodox Jews there. And anyway, as the Sabbath is approaching at sunset on Friday, just before that in the afternoon, in the marketplace, all these people are gathered, and there's this really friendly atmosphere, one of excitement, kind of like what we have when it's Christmas Eve. And it's just there's this anticipation. Hey, the Sabbath is coming. It's going to be here soon. And you can really get carried away in this. And then you go to the Wailing Wall when the Sabbath comes, and all these pious Jews are there, and it's like, whoa, this is just so cool. And you get thinking, wow, if I weren't a Christian, I could really get involved in this because there's this pull toward it. And if you are a skeptic, an atheist, that is, in Jerusalem, in Old City Jerusalem, on the Sabbath, you're going to feel really out of place, and you're going to feel a draw in that direction. Well, it's the same way over here in the West, but in the opposite direction. We have a secular nation that has ethics that many of which are very anti or counter-Christian. Counter-Christian, even anti-Christian. If you hold to ethics, let's say sexual ethics and ethics on marriage that go against the biblical worldview, the biblical ethics, you are in a minority. You are going to be mocked and called homophobic and transphobic and all these kinds of things. And this especially, all your television shows, it's not just our culture, it's everything that's part of that. It's on social media. It's in the entertainment industry with movies, and like every show on television has your token LGBTQ plus person now, and all this stuff going on, and it's just propaganda. It is trying to minimize these things, and it does happen over time. It's like, hey, back in the 50s, you really didn't see this glorification of relationships, same sex, or even adulterous relationships, or all these people having sex prior to marriage. And we've grown so accustomed to seeing these things on television and in movies glorified, like these great romances that you hook up and you have sex and sex relationships before marriage. It's nothing now to see this kind of things. We get kind of conditioned to see it. And it's the same thing with the LGBTQ plus stuff that's going on right now. And you start to get empathetic, even sympathetic to these kinds of things. And we become part of that culture. And so our morals go down. And so that's why if you go off to the university, you need to get involved in a campus ministry with like-minded Christians to fellowship with them. It's absolutely necessary in our secular nation.
Dr. Marcus, you're talking about, going to just college and Christian. So I went to Temple University in Philadelphia, and I remember, just the classes. And one of the classes, I remember one of my tests were who was right when it came to the Garden of Eden, God or the devil. That was like one of my classes. I mean, it was just crazy. And I remember being on college campus and just interacting with so many different people. Temple University was the most diverse college in the nation at the time. So I had friends that were Muslim and just all different backgrounds, but having to be sure in my faith and understand what I believe and standing firm on it. But I love what you brought up about being connected to a campus ministry. And so I was part of InterVarsity, and it was every Thursday we would get together, we'd go to this house, and it was a house where it was co-ed. There was co-ed living, but the men and women were on separate floors, and there was no commingling, if you know what I mean. But we would go, and there would be 40 of us would be in this house. We were packed, and we'd eat food, and we would fellowship, and we would just talk. And for me, that was just such a turning point in my life because I was going out to the parties and doing different things, but at least I knew there was a safe space where I could go and talk about Jesus, talk about my faith, have people that would hold me accountable when it came to sexual purity and different things of that sort. Because what does break my heart is I think, when you're talking about it's the perversion that's in our culture and just the immorality that's happening that we're just oh yeah, it's all good and it's all okay. But there's a lot of people that are so damaged from it, and it's very messy. And so my heart is even for young people is that they would just, what you're saying is get in fellowship, get in connection, be with people that they can talk to, open up and sharing like, I'm struggling with this or I'm dealing with this, because it's really necessary, because there's so much pain that is happening in our culture and our society. And I can't even imagine, like, when I think about, you being a professor at Houston Christian University and some of the students, I can't imagine what it would be like to be 18, 19, 20 growing up nowadays. I think it would be very scary. They're dealing and battling things that I didn't have to deal with, and things of that nature and sort. So I just really love that, what you were just sharing about how important it is for young people to get into relationships. And even if you're a parent or a grandparent watching this, like, please talk, like, have a relationship with your children. And just have an ear to listen and to hear like what we're walking through and going through, and don't point the finger like this is wrong, but let's have a real like, seriously, a real conversation and dialogue, because y'all were tearing up and doing crazy stuff too back in the day. And then
True.
I also wanted to hear, Dr. Mike, your thoughts, because you alluded to the entertainment industry and the immorality and things that are happening and surfacing. And there was like a recent thing went viral on TikTok and just social media about Russell Brand, who's this British actor that is exploring Christianity. And we're seeing more and more celebrities that are finding their way to truth and to Jesus. Just want to know like your takes and your thoughts of, what you're seeing even in that way with the culture. Just want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'm not I don't kind of follow the pop culture that much, so I wasn't aware of that. So anyone who really finds their way to Christianity, whether they're celebrity or not, I'm happy with that. I do think we, as Christians, we have to be careful about the celebrity culture, and when they come over to become Christians and talk about Christianity, we can rejoice in that, but I don't think we should be holding them up as anything special, because people typically in the entertainment industry aren't the most balanced people, you could say. I don't know how to put it, but a lot of them, because of their celebrity status, they're happy in some ways, but they have destructive lives in many other ways, and they turn to drugs and alcohol, and they're ultimately the success that they have doesn't bring them happiness. So I rejoice when they come over, but that doesn't mean, it's like we got an election coming up here in the United States, and there are going to be celebrities that take, one position or the other, for one candidate or the other. But we got to be careful, because just because they're a celebrity doesn't mean they're discerning in any way, and that we should listen to what they say because of their celebrity status. So yeah, again, I rejoice when the celebrities do come to know Christ. I'm sad when they leave Christ. But the person who is working in the department store, or the single mother who is working 2 jobs to support her family, she's every bit as important as that celebrity. And we need to keep that in mind.
I like that, Dr. Mike. That's like a balance. Like, I know what you were saying is that because there's like, we put them they're already on this pedestal, that we already idolize them a lot of times in our culture. And it is exciting, and we rejoice when they come over, to the kingdom of God and come out of the darkness. But at the same time, they're people just like us. Sanctification is a process. And so I think we see a lot of times like, oh, let's put him as a speaker and a main person. I'm like, they're just a babe in Christ, and so that I really like that perspective that you shared. And, one final last thing is that, you have Risen Jesus, you have a podcast. Can you just share for people to go find you and the resources that you have, and just the great things that you do for the kingdom of God, so people can get to know their Creator and Jesus well?
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for the invitation to do that, Sydney. So we have a website, risenjesus.com, that has some articles on it. It points to some videos that we have as well. We do have a YouTube channel. Back to the website, I speak all around the country, and even sometimes outside of the country. So if someone's interested in having me speak to their group, they can check out the topics I speak on, and how to book something on my website, risenjesus.com. We have a YouTube channel. They can just type in my name, Mike Licona, and it will come up, or it's youtube.com/Mike Licona official, I think it's called. We've got over 500 videos, getting lots of views on that. We cover a lot of different topics. A lot of my public debates are on there that can be viewed. Our lectures, we have a lot of shorts or reels, whatever they're called, on YouTube. I have an Instagram account, Twitter, a public figure Facebook page that they can visit. On my personal page, I don't really take people if I don't know them, but they can go to my public figure page. We post stuff there, and so that's how they can follow me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mike, for joining. So make sure you check out risenjesus.com. And you're watching here on YouTube, go check it out because there's so many materials. There's so much content so you can understand, learn, because it's so important for us to be able to understand why we believe our faith, have the historical evidence, and be able to defend it. So, Dr. Mike, thank you so much for just your time, all that you shared, your stories, your insight. I truly enjoyed our conversation today.
Thanks, Sydney. It's always a delight to talk with you, my sister.
I really appreciated what Dr. Mike Licona was sharing about his personal journey, his walk, his doubts, and just his whole experience of truly finding out the existence of Jesus and the resurrection and the truth of the Gospels. And, I think that's something that a lot of us have wrestled through, we walked through, we talked about in our conversation. And, as I was preparing for this episode of the podcast, I found this video on TikTok, and it's between a believer and someone who doesn't believe. So take a look at this.
What's your relationship like with God?
Well, what is God?
See, lots of people say the universe.
Don't tell me what would people say.
What do I
say?
think God is?
Yeah.
Well, personally, I don't believe it. I believe in self-agency, so I make things happen in my life. So I don't believe there's a higher power.
So who created the reality that gives you the ability to conceptualize this thought? 1, 2, plan for the future. 3, live in this reality. 4, make your heart pump beat. 4, give you consciousness. 5, give you a father that loves you. 6, gives you emotions towards your father. 7, gives father emotions towards you. 8, you guys share DNA. 9, you guys probably share a bond that you can't really explain through science. How do you explain those things?
I mean, I would say that's a lot of positive things, but how would you explain all the negatives like cancer, kids dying of terrible diseases? There's lots of bad things in the world as well. So if God made all those positive things, then he must have made the negative things. So why would he have done that?
It's merely an expression of the human condition, because the human condition is manifested in reality. So you see wars, you see turmoil, you see all these things happening. It's not pointing at God. It's pointing at our deficiency and our need for God.
But God made us. So why
Yes.
would he make us with deficiencies? Why would he allow us to be on a yacht here and kids dying in Africa? That doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense. And that's the beauty about reality, is that it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be. And you have to surrender to the fact that you may not understand everything. And if an entity that is so powerful is supposed to be conceptualized and completely understood within the matter that resides inside of our head, then it wouldn't be really worth worshiping, would it?
Why does something have to create our reality? Because obviously, if we're saying God created our reality, who created God? It keeps going and going and going. There needs to be an end point.
Well, no, that's under the assumption that God abides within natural law. So if God abides outside of time, space, and matter, in the beginning, time, God created heaven, space, and the earth, matter. So in order to create time, space, and matter, you need to be outside of time, space, and matter. He created time, space, and matter. You're just bound to it. That's why you don't comprehend it.
Whew. When I saw that, the way that brother broke it down, it just made a lot of sense. And I just appreciated how he was just straight to the point. But even being able to have a conversation with the other gentleman who said he didn't believe in God, he believed in self-agency. That's what he's saying. And so, had no concept and didn't understand, because I know there's a lot of arguments too when we talk about the existence of God, when we talk about, what I believe in. Well, if there's really a God, why do bad things happen? And I really like what the other guy was saying is that you have to surrender to it. And there's certain things that are out of our control. And also that we have to recognize as human beings that we have such a fallen nature. God did not design us and did not create us to be, these people that would go off and kill each other and do all these things. It's because of the fall in the beginning. What we see in the book of Genesis, this is the manifestation of that. Because we stepped out of God's design, because we were disobedient to God, we begin to see the fall of man. We begin to see these atrocities and these things unfold and develop in our world that was never God's plan at all. It was never God's plan for people to die. It was never God's plan for there to be cancer. It was never God's plan for all these terrible things to be unfolding in our world. But because God's love for us, because of what he did for us, and he sent Jesus, right? And that Jesus did die and did rose again. Because of the resurrection, it gives us the power to live from the bondage and live in freedom that we cannot experience outside of Christ. This show today, this podcast, this episode, God really spoke to me how important it would be. And if you've been sticking along the whole time, thank you so much for watching and tuning in, because I feel like it's really critical. I feel like it's really important. And what God was speaking to me today is this is about your eternity. This is about your existence. This is about the state of your soul, and it's the condition of your heart. And it's so important. There's nothing wrong with doubt. There's nothing wrong with questions. Maybe you stumbled upon the Glory Hour and you were watching and you came across it on YouTube and you wanted to check it out and see what these Christians are saying. But the heart of the matter is the reason that we did this show and why God spoke to my heart to do it is because it's this moment right here. And I truly believe there's somebody that's watching. And as you're watching, it doesn't matter what day of the week or when, but I know this was a specific time for you to know that God does not fear your doubt, and maybe you have a lot of questions, and it's okay to ask the questions. That's what I loved about Dr. Mike and his transparency about what he was walking through and searching for the evidence. And even in the midst of it, he had doubts and questions. God is not afraid of your questions. God is not afraid of what you're walking through and going through. There's been many times in my life where I have cried out to God. I don't understand what's going on. I'm like, if you're good, God, then all these bad things are going on. I've had those same questions in my life that I've directed towards God. And so if that's you today, I just encourage you, take your thoughts to Jesus. Ask God to prove himself to you, because I truly believe he wants to do that. He wants to make himself known to you. And I just wanted to share, some of my personal experience and also a scripture that God dropped in my heart that I really believe will speak to you. And it comes out of Matthew 16, chapter 16, verses 15 through 17. And it says this: Jesus said to them, "But who do you say I am?" He's speaking to the disciples. And Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." When it comes to this issue, this thing of faith, of Jesus, the biggest thing that has been true in my life, that Jesus, it's out of a revelation and a relationship. That is one of my favorite scriptures in the Bible, and just thinking about it is, back in those times, they didn't have Google, obviously. They didn't have social media, obviously. But it was out of their relationship with Jesus and walking with them that God revealed who Jesus was and is to this day. This whole matter of Jesus, it's a revelation. That's how it was created. If you even look back to Abraham, and when God called him to leave his country, leave his father behind, and to go set out, and God was establishing a new covenant. Covenant connotates relationship. And it was all out of having this one-on-one relationship with God, that he would hear from God and God would speak to him, that he would come into this relationship and come into this revelation and understanding of who God is. And so we see throughout in the Old Testament, which I love, is they started having these names for God, that you are El Shaddai, that you are, Jehovah Jireh, you are my provider, all these different things, because it was based out of their experiences, that's how they would know God. And so I just want to encourage you today. Who is God to you? Maybe you're like the religious nuns and God is nobody. But can I tell you that God is somebody? He is the creator of the universe. And maybe it's because of that church hurt. Maybe it's because of something that happened in your past that you have ran away from it and you don't want anything to do with it. But I feel like if you're watching this and this is you, you've stuck around this whole time because God has something to say to you and he's been trying to get your attention. You know, there's a lot of people that you probably think, you know, the TV preachers and all of this, and they're saying, you give your life to Jesus and your life is going to change, your life is going to change. And I'm not going to promise that everything's going to become perfect, because that's not the gospel. But what I can say to you is that there is a God in heaven that loves you. There's a God in heaven that sees you. And everything that you're walking through and everything that you're going through, you know, one of the names of Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And so even in my own personal quest, when it came to Jesus, and when I was in college and I was searching things out in the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and looking at different things and exploring, to me, what I realized is that there was only one God that came from the mountain, and that was Jesus. There was only one God who was willing to come down and live in life as a man and understand the pain and the turmoil and the suffering and the things that we go through. There was only one God that did that, and his name is Jesus. And that one God, Jesus, Yeshua, the Messiah, came during a very turbulent time in government, in society, but he was willing to come down for you and for me. And then he went to that cross. He died. Most painful death. I can't even imagine, his nails on the cross. Died, resurrected in 3 days. And I think a lot of times what happens is we get stuck on just, okay, Jesus resurrected. He did resurrect, but you know, he came back and he walked the earth for about 40 days. And he started talking and he wanted to give us the keys of the kingdom, because what I think Christianity has done a really poor job of doing is just trying to get people saved just for the sake of eternity. But God wants you to experience heaven now, and wants you to have a relationship and to live out of wisdom and revelation of what's going on and what's happening. It's not like we just give our lives to Jesus and that's it, and I'm just going to wait to die. No, there's so much more in that. There's healing, there's deliverance, there's wholeness, there's things that he wants to do in you. And when you surrender it all and you give your life to Jesus, he begins to do the deep work within you. And I'll end with this. For me, I knew that Jesus was real. I didn't have the opportunity, like Dr. Mike Licona shared, of doing a doctoral dissertation, which I think is fascinating and amazing. And I love how God puts us all on different journeys. But for me, when it really became real is I had an encounter with the living God. I remember after college, I graduated. I went to my church, Petra International Ministries. I was about, I'd been like 20, I think I was around 26, 27. And I was in a desperate part of my life, like just questioning everything, like my existence. Why am I here? I don't know what's going on. And it was when I had these really tangible moments in worship, just on my knees, just me and Jesus, one-on-one. And I never forget the one day I was on the ground, on my knees, and I felt the glory of God, the weight of God, where I literally could not get up. And I started weeping and crying because I had never experienced anything like it in my life. And in that moment, I believed in Jesus. Don't get me wrong. I went to church. You know, I was one of those. My mom took me to church as a child. And I went to, I was sharing with Dr. Mike Licona of like how I, joined InterVarsity at Temple University. And I was in church and I was doing all those things. But it changed for me when I had the encounter. It changed for me when Jesus invaded my space and hit me right where I was at and met me right where I was. That's why I can say that he is Emmanuel, God with us, because he was God with me in that moment. That changed everything for me, and I haven't been the same since. And so I just hope and I just pray, and I truly believe that God wanted to speak that truth into you today. And my heart is that you have an encounter, that you come to know who he is, because it will change your life. It is the best thing that you can ever do, is to give your life to Jesus. Is life going to be hard still? Yeah. Is it going to be challenging? Yeah. But you know what I've experienced? God walking on the road with me. God being in the midst of my tears and in the midst of the hardest moments and giving me wisdom, guidance, and direction that I don't care. Nobody, you can watch all the podcasts in the world. It don't matter. There's nothing like when God speaks to you and gives you a word, because that's what he ultimately wants. He wants that personal relationship that is built out of revelation. So I am so grateful that you watched today. I pray everything you watched blessed you and that seeds are planted. And maybe if you have questions about Jesus, you have questions about your faith, reach out to us. We're always here at thegloryhour@ctvn.org. You can leave a comment even on the chat here on YouTube, or you can give us a call here at Cornerstone Television Network, where we produce and broadcast out of for the Glory Hour at 888-665-4483, because we have prayer partners, people who love to talk with you. We're here for you. So on that note, I just want to say I love you, and we'll see you next time.